Villacreces from the IDB. Usual disclaimer applies. A case for leaning against the wind in commodity-dependent economies. Basically, we provide a welfare evaluation of cyclically adjusted fiscal rules. And in particular, we try to answer the question, what is the optimal response of fiscal spending to cyclical fluctuations in fiscal revenues? Okay, we are going to be, this paper is applicable to many, many economies, but we are going to be particularly interested in what we call commodity-dependent economies, which are countries in which a large share of output exports, and very important for the purpose of this paper, fiscal revenues are dependent on international commodity price fluctuations. Okay, so here to motivate the paper, so if you imagine that fiscal revenues are the summation of tax revenues by tau and commodity revenues by commodity, okay, pi tau is a function of the output gap, basically, while the revenues for the commodity-related revenues are a function of the international commodity price gap. So as you can see from these lines here, these two cycles are very, very different, and we conjecture that the optimal response to these two types of revenues are going to be different. Okay. Ultimately, we want to answer the question: can fiscal policy rules stabilize economic cycles while at the same time maximize consumer welfare? Okay, and we are going to find that the answer is a resounding yes. How do we do that? Okay, this is okay. Okay, now it's working. So, of course, this is a short presentation. I don't have time to go over the full model, which is a relatively large-scale New Keynesian model with an augmented fiscal rule. But let me give you a couple of the ingredients. There are going to be two types of households: Ricardian and hand-to-mouth non-Ricardian households. So fiscal rules, fiscal policy is actually important. There are going to be four types of goods, 4 different production functions. You're a host of real and nominal rigidities. There's going to be a central bank running a Taylor rule. Unlike a couple of rival papers in the literature, we endogenize commodity production, and we introduce a very important feasibility constraint for the fiscal rule, which are going to help us quantitatively by a lot. Okay, our case study is going to be Chile, as I said before. This paper is applicable to many, many economies. Okay, I need to fix some notation. So fiscal policy, there's going to be a standard budget constraint. Net foreign assets, the government net foreign assets tomorrow is going to be net foreign assets today after interest payments, plus the fiscal surplus. Okay, very simple fiscal surplus is government revenues, tax revenues, and commodity revenues minus government spending. There are going to be 3 types of spending components here: consumption, investment, and transfers. Okay, consumption will enter the utility function in a CES format. Very standard here. We estimate the complementarity between public and private consumption. Government investment, in turn, will enter a law of motion for capital, producing capital goods, which in turn enters the private production functions in the economy. Okay, none of our main results depend on this assumption, but we just want to have the fiscal block, the richer, the better. Okay, transfers are also important because we are going to use them as a baseline fiscal instrument in order to implement the cyclically adjusted rule. So let me go directly to the core of the paper, which is this equation. In the paper, we derived this equation. Okay, here I'm simplifying the notation a little bit. Basically, the cyclically adjusted fiscal rule, a suitable representation of the Chilean case at least, which is applicable to many other countries in Latin America at least, is that government spending consistent with the rule is going to be, okay, pay your interest. You always want to pay your interest on your net foreign asset position, or if you have net foreign assets, if this is positive, you are able to actually spend these structural revenues from your assets, okay? But the important part here is the second and third terms, okay? You're going to be spending your current revenues plus a cyclical adjustment that depends on the gap between current tax revenues and long-run revenues, and the same for the commodity revenues, okay? So the idea here is to save in good times and save in bad times. Pretty standard cyclically adjusted rule. With this, it's very large with respect to the long-run value. You are going to be spending less. And this cyclical adjustment will be governed by this very key parameter kappa, which will show up all over the place in my slides from now on, okay? This kappa allows some very nice analytics. If kappa equal to 0, you have your classical procyclical balance budget rule. Basically, this collapses to, okay, pay your interest and spend your current revenues. If the economy is doing well, tax revenues and commodity revenues are high, the government spends a lot, and the opposite happens when the economy is in a recession. We know this is very bad. This amplifies economic cycles and is very bad for consumers. The Chilean mandate, in particular, is to act acyclically. Okay, it is called the structural balance rule because, and it's and you get that with a kappa equal to 1. This collapses to, okay, again, pay your interest and spend according to your structural revenues, not your current revenues. Okay. Any value of kappa greater than 1 will be increasingly countercyclical policies. Okay. For example, with a kappa equal to 1, which is a nice benchmark we use in the paper, although we evaluate all the way up. Basically, the rule is saying, okay, pay your interest, spend according to your structural revenues, and make an additional adjustment. Again, in good times, you will be decreasing your structural spending. Okay, so this is like the structural balance rule on steroids, in the sense that you will be using fiscal policy as an active stabilization tool. In practice, we do 2 refinements to this rule. Okay, the first one, motivated by the first slide, is that we allow for revenue-specific fiscal rules. Okay, there are going to be 2 parameters instead of 1, governing the fiscal response, the spending response to these 2 cycles. Okay, precisely because of the motivation I gave you at the beginning. In particular, the commodity cycle, which will affect commodity revenues, is a function of the commodity price gap, which has a volatility that is 1 order of magnitude greater than the one of the business cycle. And these 2 cycles are actually very poorly correlated. Okay, so you can imagine that the optimal response to these 2 cycles are not going to be the same. The second improvement or refinement is to add this feasibility constraint, basically an additional kappa parameter, okay, that will limit large deviations from fiscal debt or assets from the long run value. Okay, basically what we buy with this parameter is to avoid the unit root behavior of the net foreign asset position of the government. Okay, you can see here, this is a long simulation of the model, 2 counterfactual simulations with the exact same set of shocks. The exact same of shocks, same parameters, everything is the same, except that in one we activate the feasibility constraint and the other one we should off the feasibility constraint. You can see that these basically behave like a unit root with an autocorrelation equal to 1. Okay, and this is not very useful to run a fiscal rule, because you can see here that government net foreign assets can spend like 1,000 years in positive values, which is completely unfeasible and unsustainable. Okay, the same can happen on the debt side. Okay, by putting this parameter and estimating with data, okay, we basically put the model in the order of magnitude of the autocorrelation and the standard deviation of fiscal debt consistent with the data. Okay, this is a huge improvement from regarding other papers in the literature. Okay, as I said, we estimate the model using Bayesian methods with a large set of observables. In particular, we provide all observables on the fiscal side, including government debt, okay, in order to discipline well this parameter here. In the simple case with 1 kappa, we estimate a value very close to 1, depending on the specification of the model, and in our baseline is 1.05. Okay, which is a very good job from the Chilean authorities, because the mandate by law is to use a value of 1. So we actually estimate a very close number there. And for kappa B, we estimate a value of 0.60. Okay, this very small value is the one I used in the simulation I showed you before. So it looks like small, but is buying us a lot. In the refined case with revenue-specific kappas, we get a mildly countercyclical policy, 1.15 in the baseline. Okay, and basically an acyclical policy with respect to commodities. So again, very good job by the Chilean authorities. They are behaving in the last 20 and so years. They are behaving very close to the mandate. Okay, but the question is, how much countercyclicality of fiscal activism through these 2 parameters here is actually desirable? So then is our welfare analysis, okay, very standard. We compute consumption equivalent units. We fix the acyclical rule, kappa tau and kappa commodity equal to 1 as our reference model. Then we build large grids for these two parameters. For all this exercise, we keep kappa B at the estimated value. Okay, so the feasibility constraint is fixed at 0.2. Okay, but we get grids for kappa tau and kappa commodity, and basically ask the both type of households, the Ricardian and non-Ricardian households, how much they are willing to pay in order to be indifferent between the rule under analysis, any particular combination of these two kappas, against the acyclical benchmark. Okay, so this is built in such a way that a positive value of lambda means welfare gains. Okay, this is the main result of the paper. Okay, I'm repeating the equation here to emphasize that in this exercise we keep fixed the feasibility constraint, and we are playing with these grids of these two feedback parameters. Okay, the left panel is for welfare gains of non-Ricardians, and the right panel is the welfare gains for Ricardians. Okay, the y-axis is the welfare gain in percent terms with respect to the structural balance rule, the acyclical rule, okay, which is marked here with this vertical line at 1. And the x-axis is different values, increasing values for kappa tau, and the line is fixing one particular slice of the value for kappa commodity, which is equal to 1, very close to the estimated value, and it turned out to be very close to the actual optimal value. Okay, but later I'm going to show you what happened when you change kappa CO. For now, let me keep kappa CO, kappa commodity equal to 1 fixed. Okay, and here we are changing kappa tau. You can see here what we already know, that pro-cyclical policies, values of kappa tau lower than 1, are very bad for consumers, especially for non-Ricardian consumers that cannot smooth consumption on their own. Okay, for example, a balanced budget rule, pretty standard rule, generates around 1% welfare loss. 1% of lifetime consumption is a huge welfare loss, and this is increasing in how much. The more pro-cyclical you behave, the more welfare gains for non-Ricardians. The same happens for Ricardians, but you can see that the order of magnitude of the welfare gains here and losses is one order of magnitude lower. Okay, because these guys are smoothing consumption on their own anyways. They don't match. They don't matter much what the government is actually doing. Okay, so the conclusion here is that the optimized kappa tau is strongly counter-cyclical, especially for non-Ricardians, is around a value of 3, which is much larger than the 1.1 we estimate in the Chilean case. Okay, so the Chilean case is nice because you are avoiding pro-cyclical rules, but at the same time, there is a lot of space in which you can generate welfare improvements. Here, the maximum is around 0.5% of lifetime consumption gains for the non-Ricardians. In the case of Ricardians, this keeps increasing asymptotically for a very long time. The actual optimal value of kappa tau is around 30. Okay, but again, this is a model of fiscal policy. What we really care is about the non-Ricardian. So let's see what happens now when we move kappa commodity. Okay, which is the second part of the result. For example, this is a line in which kappa commodity equals to 0. This is a pro-cyclical value. Okay. What happened is that in the case of non-Ricardian, it doesn't matter much. Okay, again, these guys are smoothing whatever the government is doing. Okay, while for non-Ricardians, it depends on the value of kappa tau. In particular, for values of kappa tau below 4 or 3.5, which is the relevant quantitative case, actually being acyclical dominates the line of pro-cyclical kappa commodity. Okay. And the difference looks small, but again, being acyclical with respect to the commodity revenues is better than being pro-cyclical. Okay, but the question is, how much counter-cyclicality do we want in this kappa commodity? Actually, that is very bad. Okay, this yellow line is now with a kappa commodity equal to 2. Okay, you can see that this yellow line is dominated by the acyclical case and also by the pro-cyclical case in most of the range for kappa tau, and it's actually very hard to get welfare gains in this range here, and they are very small by behaving counter-cyclically with respect to commodity. Why is that the case? Okay, it turns out we realize that there are a couple of reasons for this. First, there is a very small correlation between commodity revenues and household revenue. Instead, there is a large correlation, a positive correlation between tax revenues and household income. So when the economy is doing well, household income is high, tax revenues are high, and it makes a lot of sense for the government to lean against the wind and stabilize the economy by behaving counter-cyclically with respect to tax revenues. But that's not the case with the commodity, because the wealth, commodity wealth in the country pertains 1/3 to the government and 2/3 to the rest of the world, basically through profits from foreign direct investment. Okay, so when the commodity cycle is increasing and the commodity prices are high, the government is getting rich, but indirectly households that is not the case. So actually behaving counter-cyclically with respect to commodity may end up restraining government expenditure when the economy might be in a recession from the point of view of the tax revenue. So that's actually a bad choice. And you can see here in the figure. Okay, so the conclusion is be counter-cyclical with respect to tax revenues and rather acyclical or even a little bit pro-cyclical if you want to maximize welfare gains of the Ricardian household. But as I said, I prefer to maximize these guys here that are hand-to-mouth and financially constrained. That's most likely an optimal decision. Or in other words, the larger the share of hand-to-mouth financially constrained households in the economy, the more likely the optimal policy is to behave counter-cyclically. Okay, so the final slide shows, these two plots shows the combinations of welfare gains for non-Ricardians. I'm focusing on non-Ricardians now in the y-axis. Okay, the combinations of welfare gains you can reach together with changes in the standard deviation of GDP growth, so macro stability here, and change in the standard deviation of government spending, so the fiscal instrument volatility. Okay, of course there is a cost of doing this counter-cyclical policy. If you see this plot, this is a win-win situation, a win-win strategy to behave counter-cyclical. You increase welfare gains, and for example, in this optimal value of 3, you get 0.5% of welfare gain, which is very big, and a 4% decline in the standard deviation of GDP growth. So you are actually maximizing welfare of the poor hand-to-mouth household while at the same time stabilizing the economy. The cost is that, of course, you are doing so by introducing a lot of fiscal activism in the economy. So, of course, the standard deviation of government spending is increasing in the amount of counter-cyclicality you introduce in the rule. Okay, but we claim in the paper that this cost you are paying for reaching these two very good news is very small. Okay, it's an increase of around 8% in the standard deviation of government spending. Let's say 10%. Okay, so this is saying that if in an acyclical policy of 1, the standard deviation of government spending is around 5%. Okay, if you increase that by 10%, so 5%, you will be able to reach big welfare gains, and at the same time you are going to be stabilizing the economy. Okay, so win-win situation from the point of view of macro stability, and there is a little bit of a trade-off here with respect to fiscal instrument volatility. So I have 1 minute. Let me conclude there with the main takeaways I want you to take from this presentation. So the optimize, we are not talking about optimal because I will need to solve the social plan and so on. This is a simple rule, simple and implementable rule that is optimized through a numerical evaluation. You should behave strongly, not counter-cyclical, strongly counter-cyclical with respect to tax revenues and rather acyclical with respect to the commodity revenues. This type of rule generates significant welfare gains. The numbers are there. Even the number for a Ricardian household is relatively large relative to optimizing a Taylor rule. Okay, so in that sense, fiscal policy seems to be very effective in generating welfare gains. As I said, this minimizes macroeconomic volatility. I didn't show this in the presentation, but in the paper, we work out different alternatives for the fiscal instrument, either transfer, government consumption, government investment, and we get that the fiscal instrument of lump sum transfer is the most efficient one in generating welfare gains and declines in macro volatility. And as I said before, quantitatively, our main contribution is this feasibility constraint, which is absolutely key to generate an implementable rule. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Answer questions.
So let's open up for questions. a small group, so you don't have to put your hand up. You can just ask. Thank Chris. Go ahead.
So, I mean, you've separated out the commodity revenues from the output gap, fully. What happens in countries when the output gap is more a function of the commodity revenues? How do you think about that?
Yeah, yes, that's a very good question because tax revenues can be, if you are a commodity dependent economy and there's a commodity boom in the international markets, tax revenues also will increase.
Right.
Yeah. But here I'm thinking more in as a state-owned company. For example, in Chile, 1/3 of the commodity production is produced by a state-owned company. The same happens in Colombia. Similar happens in Mexico and Brazil with there is typically a large state-owned company that get direct revenues from this commodity. So when I talk about by commodity, the revenue from commodity, I'm thinking in these state-owned companies. While the increase in tax revenues, for example, because the multinational companies that also operate in the country are paying additional taxes, that would enter that would be incorporated in the tax revenue still. Okay, so that's the way we separate this, and we calibrate the model in that sense. So literally in the model, there is a parameter that regulates how much of the commodity wealth is produced by the government directly. Okay, in the Chilean case, is 1/3. In the Colombian case, I think it's a little bit larger.
Yeah. It depends if you measure the share on GDP or on exports.
Yeah, it will change. Here I'm talking about production. How much the country produces. 1/3 is produced by the government. So I take that parameter to calibrate the model. Of course, the real world is a little bit more complicated, but that's actually the same calibration used by the Central Bank of Chile. Here I'm using basically the model used by the Central Bank with an additional bells and whistles in order to build a richer fiscal block. But other than that, it's the calibration of the Central Bank, and the estimation is very similar. With the only difference that I include government debt as an additional observable in the estimation, which actually helps a lot in this capturing well this feasibility constraint.
Can I just ask? I have a follow-up question related to Chris's question. So, I mean, what you see in the South African case, we also a big commodity exporter, is that generally commodity revenues, overall tax revenues, economic activity are very much correlated, right? Because you've got a large terms of trade shock, whereas in your case, you seem not to have it.
Absolutely, that's
a bit surprising. So that's my one question. My other question is, I mean, whether your results are very dependent on the shares between these kind of non-forward-looking and more way-off.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So first, there is the belief in Chile, for example, that when the commodity is doing well, the country is doing well. But look at this figure. Can I go back to my previous figure? Yeah. So you see this, okay? The volatility of the red line, the commodity cycle, is 1 order of magnitude larger than the blue line, okay? This is governed by an AR1 in the model, right? If you estimate the autocorrelation is very high. So with this type of persistence and volatility, there is no way you actually get a very large positive correlation between these two lines, because this cycle is much more persistent. Actually, I had before this project, I believe exactly the same as you, that these two cycles would correlate. There are particular cases. I mean, if you focus in the period between 2003 and 2013, you probably get positive correlation. But in the long run, that's not the case. 0.1 is a very low correlation. So I would bet that if you build a similar figure like this for South Africa, you would be surprised about the lower correlation about these two cycles. Of course, there are moments in which these two correlate, but not necessarily the case. Which is the main commodity you actually produce?
Platinum.
Yeah, but all commodity prices are super correlated. So
yeah, I think the issue is more that in the Chilean case, the the copper exports are essentially nationalized, right? But the revenue at least, not nationalized, but the
One third is national.
That is taken by government entirely, whereas in South Africa, there's a large chunk of the revenue goes directly to the private sector. It isn't taxed very effectively.
Exactly.
So the revenue comes into the private companies, it goes into the wage bill, et cetera, that's coming in and feeds the broader economy. So you wouldn't get, I don't think you get quite the same kind of clean result here. Where,
Yeah.
But you're gonna have money coming into the banking system, deposits increase, that type of stuff, which.
Yeah.
depends on how government handles its deposit.
Everything you said is true, but you need to multiply by 1/3, because when I say that 2/3 of the commodity wealth literally flew out the country,
Yeah.
is the case. If you see the period of the commodity boom of the 2000, you see the trade balance going crazy positive, and the rent payments of the FDI goes exactly like a mirror, negative. So this is a particular period in which these multinational companies, Canadian and Australian mining companies operating in the country, take huge profits back to their countries.
Right.
So actually the current account is very close to zero. The trade balance goes crazy positive, but the current account is of course it goes up. But if you weight the income payments, I mean, they are huge. I have a figure. I'm going to include that figure in the. Your second question was?
I think let's move to Jose.
Okay.
3 minutes.
Okay.
Yes, really fast. I found really interesting what you did with the feasibility constraint. Usually, what we do to avoid the unit root in net foreign assets is to have like this Schmidt-Grohe Uribe and Schmidt-Grohe,
Absolutely.
and it's really nice. Even though there's a lot of doubts that everybody has, like for example Mendoza regarding like the estimation of the values of these parameters, it seems like you find like a really, because that parameter is really hard to pin down, but it has like a nice implication between net foreign position and risk premium, like country risk premium.
Yes.
So what is the rationale for that feasibility and how it relates with the
So your analogy is perfect. Actually, I mentioned this in the paper. This acts very similar to the Schmidt-Grohe Uribe closing device for a small open economy. Okay, you want to break the unit root in the private sector that you use. Actually, this model has the debt elastic interest rate they propose in their 2003 paper. The difference, there's a big difference. They say, okay, this is a closing device just to break the unit root. So we don't want this parameter in the Schmidt-Grohe version to affect the dynamics of the model. So they calibrate a very small number. The argument there is, okay, we're going to put a very small number. We break the unit root. We can solve the model in the computer. Okay. Here I'm doing much more. I want to change the dynamics of the model, because the dynamics of the model are crazy. I mean, nobody would run a fiscal rule in which government debt can spend 1,000 years in positive or negative values. That's unfeasible. Okay, so you really want to change the dynamics of the model, and that's why I don't calibrate a very small number here. I provide data to the model and estimate the parameter. Okay, so the analogy in terms of breaking the unit root. Okay, it's not that I'm breaking by a lot, but a small. I mean, when you have a close to unit root process, small changes around the 0.99 can have a huge change in the dynamics. That's what I'm doing here. So same qualitative idea, but quantitatively, I'm actually disciplining this parameter, not with a small number to break the unit root. I want to break the unit root and do it in a quantitatively relevant way. That's the difference.
Just a small intervention. So I'm also struggling. I mean, I had similar question to Chris in terms of this distribution of revenues. But even if 2/3 is going to the private sector, which is like foreign companies, so I would assume, unless maybe they have these tax breaks, I would assume they will be paying tax anyway. And I would also assume that your PIT should be responding to commodity goods somehow. And that should feed through to your output. So I'm just struggling to understand why there is no effect of CIT. You don't see the effect of PIT in terms of your sort of the normal revenues feeding in through the commodity channel. I don't understand that.
The PIT is personal. You know,
Ah,
the thing that you say,
Yes.
CIG's corporate.
yeah, thank you so much.
Sorry.
Yeah, so corporate income taxes are embedded here, okay, and they do rise when the commodity price is going up. But what is of first order importance from the point of view of the there's also a royalty. There's also a royalty, but it's very small in case of Chile. They should be higher. But what is first order is that the state-owned company. I mean, let me put it this way. For any additional tax payments of the multinationals operating in the country, the direct production of the state-owned company is of much larger importance in terms of the total fiscal revenue. Okay, that's the way I'm trying to map the model into the data. Okay, what you say is true. Government personal income taxes also tend to rise because typically when commodity revenues are high, the economy is doing well, so there's more economic activity, personal income increases, so people is actually paying more taxes. Okay, but given the different cycles of these two cycles I showed you before, it's very likely that there are periods in which the economy is doing badly in terms of the standard business cycle, while, for example, around here, I mean, again, there's a very small correlation here. So, you know, all what you said is happening, but what is of first order importance is the direct revenues from the state-owned company. That's my point.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. It's
Okay.
very interesting. Let's move to Ekaterina. Thank you so much.
Good morning. So this is a paper about monetary policy in South Africa. It can be thought of as a case study about monetary policy in emerging economy. And it's a joint work with Giovanni, Nicola, and Charl. And the usual disclaimer applies that views expressed here are only of author's own, shouldn't be seen as views of the South African Reserve Bank. So it doesn't work the full screen. Okay. So when we look at how we understand the monetary policy, most of the evidence comes from very few economies, in fact, mostly from the US, some evidence from the Euro area, a bit from the UK, so all advanced economies. And when we look at kind of the most state-of-the-art way to identify monetary policy effects, namely high-frequency identification, it is applied almost exclusively to advanced economies. Recent exception is India, but generally there's very little evidence. So there is still much to understand about the way how monetary policy works in empirical aspect in emerging economies. And this is what we do in this paper. We extend high-frequency identification to South African case, which is the leading way, the high-frequency identification, to study the effects of monetary policy at the moment. So in a nutshell, what is high-frequency identification is that when we look at high-frequency movements triggered by central bank announcement in financial markets. And we use these price movements as surprise component as induced by announcements. And later we tease out the exogenous shock from this surprise component and study the effect of monetary policy shock. So we apply that for South Africa, which we think is an interesting case to look at. Because it's liquid, it has liquid and developed financial markets, it's a small open economy with a modern central banking, doesn't target exchange rates. So in many ways, it works like an advanced economies. In this context, we capture or decompose the effects of monetary policy announcements with 4 factors. The first being short-term component of the announcements or the conventional monetary policy shock that moves the short end of the yield curve. Two communication surprises to medium and long horizons that move respectively the medium and long end of the yield curve and the risk factor. And I will be more precise about what it is later. And we studied the transmission of monetary policy in the event study and in proxy PR. So what it is special about emerging market economies that make people shy away from using high frequency identification in this market. So potentially poor data, markets being more volatile and unstable, less liquid, unstable policy framework. So in fact, in South Africa, this is not the case because data is good. Markets are volatile, but it's an interesting form of volatility. I will try to argue later. Markets are liquid, and policy framework has been stable, at least in the post-transition period. But on the other hand, and that's an interesting part, emerging economies have potentially difficulty balancing out different objectives, different goals, like macroeconomic stability versus external stability, and uses different tools for that. So in this, from this perspective, there is more to monetary policy in emerging economies than in advanced economies. Also, and this is what we're going to argue later, is the case that potentially in emerging economies, it's the policy reaction function is less well understood by the agents. So there is a component in the central bank communication of clarification or explanation of the policy rule. And there is a large role for risk premium shocks and big role for external shocks. So briefly, the results of the paper with regards to conventional monetary policy will show that there is a large surprise component in monetary policy decisions. So they come as a surprise. We show that monetary policy surprises correlate with central bank forecasts, which is a case for information or signaling channel of monetary policy. We show that surprises correlate also with the realized global shocks to monetary policy in US, euro area, and oil. And that's exactly the evidence in favor of the evidence that suggests that the reaction function of the central bank might not be fully understood by the agents. We show that conventional monetary policy, the changes in the short-term rate, works exactly in advanced economies in the standard manner. On the other hand, the announcements of the central bank affect also risk premium with sizable macro effects. So let me only
some silly question.
Yes.
So your second bullet point was that that the surprise correlates with the forecast. So that's not, by definition, is no surprise. If your forecast is the same as a surprise, then surprise is not. I mean, forecast is definition that you foresee something.
So the surprise when I talk, when I say the forecast, it's the central bank forecast,
Yeah.
which is disclosed at the moment of the announcement.
Oh, okay. So
When
it's
I
not,
yes,
okay. So
when I talk
not a standard forecast which is periodically published, but it's at the same time as the announcement comes.
exactly.
So it's really not a forecast. Just
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So to just briefly introduce the setting, South Africa has an independent central bank, has been inflation targeter since 2000, use a window target from 3 to 6%, flexible exchange rate, repo rate is a policy tool, 6 MPC meetings during the year. There are 6 unscheduled MPC meetings in our sample. No formalized unconventional monetary policy tools. I use no forward guidance as formalized, no QE, relatively open capital markets and liquid financial markets. So in this context, we make use of the data from the market of interest rate derivatives to capture expectations about policy at different horizons. So forward rate agreements span from horizon 4 months until 24 months. Interest rate swaps allow to capture interest rate expectations from 1 to 10 years. We also include 3 months interbank rate as an expected prevailing rate 3 months ahead, and 5 years credit default swaps in our database. So we compute daily surprises around MPC meeting dates over sample June 2002, January 2020. So to the extent that market participants update their beliefs following the announcement, we capture the update of these beliefs by computing the surprises. And the idea is that pre-announcement market value capture the expectations of the agent about how the bank is going to set the rate or what is going to announce. Whereas post-announcement market value reflect the reaction to the announcement. So the difference between the latter and the former constitute the surprise component of the announcement. So we use entire maturity structure and extract 4 principal components from this database of market surprises. So this table shows the variance contribution of 4 principal components, and in most cases we capture 90–95% of variation in the market surprises, so the major share of it. So because principal components don't allow for economic interpretation, we rotate the factors. So we impose restrictions on the rotation matrix such that it allows us to identify factors that have meaning or allow for economic interpretation. So it's important to mention that also the factors are orthogonal, so we impose the orthogonality restriction. So our 4 factors are the ones that load on short, medium, and long horizons, and the CDS. So the blue line, the short factor, is the short component of the announcement, is the only factor that loads on the short horizon, and its importance goes down for longer horizon. The medium factor kind of reflects the policy expectation, the update in the policy expectations on the horizon from 6 to 24 months. The importance of the long factor, the yellow line, increases for longer horizon, and the risk factor is kind of prevalent across horizons. So basically, our first short-term factor is this conventional monetary policy surprise. The medium and long factors capture the revision in policy expectations in the medium and long horizons, and the risk factor is the way how the bank modulates or reshapes the country risk in its response. Okay, so because it has been shown in the literature that high-frequency instruments might combine true policy shocks with information, we control for the central bank information set in our factors. So we regress each of our factors on inflation and output growth forecast and forecast revisions. So as a result, the residual of this regression is are the factors that are robust to the presence of central bank information. So, and we see that the information of the central bank plays a role in explaining surprises. Means that the market participants do extract information about the current and projected state of economy as announced by the central bank, and they respond to this information. So basically, this is the evidence in favor of signaling channel and informational asymmetries in the market. So next, we find large correlation coefficient between the short factor and changes in the policy rate. And because our factors are by construction orthogonal to the information set of the market participants, it means that changes in the policy rate are to a large extent unanticipated. So we compare this number with the counterparts for the US and the Euro area, and we find that the extent to which the policy changes are anticipated by the market in the US and Euro area is much higher because the correlation is lower with the surprise component. So next, we show that there is significant extent to which the external shocks, the monetary policy shocks in Euro area, US, the oil supply shocks have on South African identified factors. And this is an interesting evidence because the pre-announcement values already include the belief of the market about how the central bank is going to respond to the oil supply shocks or monetary policy shocks that have materialized before the MPC meeting took place. And given that market is still surprised, means that it was unable. They were unable to anticipate how the central bank is going to respond to these external factors. So we're making the case for market being uncertain about reaction of the bank to external shocks. So let me only briefly go through the event study results. Basically, we look at the financial market response to changes in our monetary policy factors a daily window. And so we show that the short factor lifts the yield curve in such a way that it flattens. So it has a large effect on short yields and a smaller effect on longer yields. The medium factor lifts the medium part of the yield curve, whereas long and risk factor rotate the yield curve, so lift the long end of the yield curve. And also the important point here is that we find a significant effect of the risk factor on an alternative measure of the country risk, the JP Morgan EBI plus South Africa. So here, we also find that the daily capital flow measures respond significantly to risk shocks. So basically, so non-resident reduce their net purchases of South African bonds and shares. So basically, kind of this is an indication that the risk factor operates via changes in the country risk premium. Again, only very briefly, the impulse responses from the VR. We instrument the conventional monetary policy shock by instrument with the short factor and normalize the effect on the 3 months interbank rate to increase by 1 percentage point. So we get the kind of classic reduction in demand, persistent reduction in prices. The yield curve responds exactly in the way as predicted by the event studies. So longer yields respond by less. The stock market values fall. The house prices go down and credit issues shrinks. So very classical case for the conventional monetary policy shock. And then let me briefly stop at the effect of the monetary policy instrumented with the risk factor. So here we normalize the effect to 1 percentage point increase in the long rate. There is a sharp pickup in the country risk premium measure, the impact reduction in non-resident net purchases of South African assets, the exchange rate depreciation, significant reduction of stock market values, credit squeeze, and the sizable contraction in demand. So let me conclude here. Basically, we find this interesting and rather compelling evidence that in addition to the conventional factor of monetary policy being the short-term interest rate being used as a tool, there is also this risk factor. So the communication affects risk premium and does have sizable effects on macro conditions. So basically, and the way we interpret this risk factor is the following. Basically, via the announcement, the bank gives the private agent information about the monetary policy preferences and how these preferences are, whether these preferences are consistent with long-run stability conditions. So either yes or no, or different extent. So, and this affects the country risk premium and how the market perceives a kind of prices risk according to this signal that the bank sends. So while the bank in emerging economy targets internal objectives, it's to a large extent constrained by the need to minimize the effect on the country risk premium also. So I'll finish here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ekaterina. Let's open up for comments, questions, suggestions. Witness, Lawrence.
Thanks, Ekaterina. Very good. Maybe two small sort of points. So the first one is what I find striking is the fact that markets are more often than not surprised. I'm trying to understand why that could be. Because I would have thought that it would sort of improve communication, reduce sort of the ideas to reduce surprises, but potentially get more. So the question is whether these surprises sort of a result of uncertainty about the sub-variation function that the markets haven't quite figured out the MPCC variation function, or is it that maybe the variation function keeps changing, which sort of then confuses the markets? So I also want to get a sense of your thought on that. And the other one is sort of small point, which as I was going through the paper, the way you construct your surprise sort of component, I felt like you say you take, I think, up to the end of the day after the announcement, something like that. I don't know if I read it correctly. That you take, you look at the price at the end of the day before the announcement, and then the day after the announcement, something like that. And so my thinking was that maybe you actually allow a lot of other factors. I understand your rationale, which is maybe because you want to allow for enough time for market players to respond. But I also thought that maybe you also might introduce other factors because of the time that you will lapse since the decision. But I just want to get a sense of what you think of that. Thank you.
Shall I take this?
Let's take Lawrence's as well.
So, Ekaterina, I thought it was a really good presentation and really interesting. And just to follow on from Witness's point, I mean, it seems clear from your paper that the reason you've chosen your one-day measure of surprise, in contrast to studies in the United States or Eurozone, is because we don't have readily available sort of intraday data, so you're not able to include a measure that measures market reactions during the day. So you're taking it at the night before, and the night before the announcement, and the end of that day, the day of the announcement, and of the statement of the MPC statement. And so I think that partly accounts for that, but Witness is right. I mean, as a result, other things can be changing at the same time. So that leads me to wonder why not try to use intraday price movements. So for example, I mean, it must be possible to get intraday price movements on currency rates, on exchange rates. So why not use a measure that takes account of whether surprises are reflected in the exchange rate movements? But that doesn't detract from the fact that I think you've done an excellent job of applying models that we're using now in the United States and UK and Eurozone, and applying it to a very different kind of economy. And I think the outcomes are good. What I'm interested in is the fact that you engage with non-standard, unconventional transmission routes. But transmission routes that are now becoming widely recognized monetary policy. So in particular, you've explicitly introduced the information channel. And you're doing that in an economy where there isn't explicit forward guidance. And that's interesting. Of course, there is, in some sense, formal guidance, but officially, SARB does not give formal guidance. Instead, the SARB position is that, well, the model, the model which SARB uses is publicly known, and hence the model provides a basis for the market itself to deduce conclusions about the way things are going to move forward, and to do that in conjunction with the MPC statement that comes out straight away after the interest rate announcement. So coming back to Witness's question, does that mean the existence of surprise comes about either because the MPC does not simply follow the model, instead it introduces its own judgments at that final stage? The answer is yes, it does. I mean, the MPC does introduce its own judgments, and that's. But is it also the case that maybe the model is not working satisfactorily? The model's not a good model, and that tends to mislead the market when they try to implement the model. And the MPC exerts judgment to make a different announcement and different forward-looking statement from the one that would come out of the model and so on. I don't know the answer to that, but it would be interesting. Particularly since you just changed the model.
I'm going to give you a minute. My take on this is that the market has its own history, its views of how the economy works, and they're not particularly receptive to alternative perspectives on this.
Yeah.
And so they revert back. When there's more uncertainty, they revert back to these very basic ways of viewing what we're going to do next. And when we don't do it, they're surprised by it. But anyway,
That's plausible. Can I ask also about the risk factor and risk premium? I mean, introducing the risk premium channel is an interesting innovation here. And since Hélène Ray developed the concept of the risk premium channel when she was developing the concept of financial cycle, it has proved to be valuable. But you seem to apply this premium in terms of the foreign exchange markets. In other words, you're applying it in terms of the transmission of effects from United States monetary policy or oil stocks that might influence this premium. Now, it's the same way that Elaine Ray does.
Mhm.
But just as a casual observer of some of the more interesting developments that occur in government circles in South Africa, and I thought there are a lot of internal political or economic structural influences, like some event, some change in the way that ESCOM is trying to solve this problem. That influences the risk premium very powerfully. But that doesn't seem to be a driver of the risk premium in your model. You don't have domestic developments driving the risk premium.
So can you please just follow up and ask Chris and maybe Elaine to ask questions during the break and see.
Shall I answer? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Maybe I start from the back and reverse order. Sorry, there was a lot I wanted to say. So with regards to the risk premium channel. So the risk premium channel that we talk about here is the one introduced kind of by the announcement. It's the bank modulating and reshaping the risk. So that would be kind of a different source to change as say the ESCOM concerns. With regards to exchange rate, we do have a version where we actually look at the exchange rate surprises also in our data set. And we found that it doesn't add to our set of factors. So in fact, the surprises in exchange rate and in risk are collinear. So effectively, the risk factor is the one that explains variation in exchange rates. So no explicit forward guidance. In fact, our second factor, the factor on the medium horizon, we are looking at them at the events, basically MPC by MPC, and kind of matching the extreme values to the statement, to what was said during the announcement, and we find that. This not formalized forward guidance used in the statement is exactly the one that is our medium factor shows. So this is not formalized forward guidance, what we capture here. So then intraday or daily surprises. So indeed, like now is the standard to use the intraday tight window, 30 minutes around the announcement to capture the surprises. And we started with that. So I say liquid markets, but to an extent. So when we look at across maturities, it's difficult to get a sense that it's a reliable price revision that we get out of it across the horizons. So we had to stop at the daily window. We look at the difference between the close price on the day of the MPC meeting compared to the close price of the previous day. So this is 1 day window. Yes, unfortunately, the intraday window just didn't work in this case for less liquid instruments.
Just to interrupt, just a clarification. That means that you're finding something which I guess we should know intuitively, which is that the South African market are not as liquid and instantaneously tradable as European market.
Not to the extent that we can employ this liquidity and rely on it in computing our surprises. So then for the policy rate being unanticipated question. So, and where does it come from? Whether that's kind of uncertainty about the reaction function or uncertainty about the state of economy. So first we check with the Bloomberg data, with the Bloomberg survey data, that it's the forecast error of the forecasters that explain a lot of the surprises at the short horizon. So it's basically market really finds it very difficult to forecast changes. So it's the errors, the forecast errors that explain our surprises. So it's not the beliefs being dispersed and then kind of there is like the center when there is an announcement made is really just difficult to forecast. And then given that the policy rule is known as is formalized in the model in the QPM, doesn't mean that that necessarily market kind of trust that. Partly because there is more to it. There is more to it from history to the extent that the statement talks about the environment, the volatility and exposure to external shocks and kind of response to that. So there is this extent to which market potentially tries to discover the reaction function, but is unable to do it consistently because the reaction function changes over time. This could be one possibility. Another possibility is that there is uncertainty about the extent to which external shocks would affect domestic macro. And this we could also see it or hear it with the discussions with investors when do you think it's a temporary, what would be effect later? So they're really trying to discover more information about this current and projected state of the economy from the bank. So there is kind of multiple kind of sources of uncertainty why that would be the case that they're unable to forecast.
Thank you, Ekaterina.
Okay, thank you very much. This joint work with Sara and Naranjo, who also works at the macroeconomic modeling department. Pretty much this is part of a kind of a bigger project that we're working on in which we try to incorporate weather-related features into our main forecasting models. As all central banks, we have like short-term econometric models for short, like nowcasting. We have some kind of semi-structural models and ESG models. So we already have like this incorporated into our semi-structural model, and we're working on the ESG model, like the full ESG model, to incorporate it. And the idea is to incorporate these shocks into the models. But the point is like, climate shocks and weather-related shocks changes across countries. It's not easy to pin down, so I'm going to talk specifically about Colombia and one specific kind of shock that is related with El Niño. Let me go there and to show you like why that is important. El Niño is a recurrent weather pattern that has like huge implications on climate around the world. The first thing that is important to notice here is that something that it may sound a little bit silly, but it is important to make this distinction. When we're talking about like climate, we're referring to climate change, to non-stationary problems, and to trends. But when we're talking about weather, we're in a stationary world. The problem with these weather fluctuations is that climate change is going to affect it. And how it's going to be affected is one of the main concerns. And this very important weather pattern that affects the Pacific Ocean has implications on weather around the world. In the case of Colombia, what it causes El Niño is a really strong droughts and lack of rains, and that has implications on food prices and energy prices. But the impact changes across country. For example, in Peru, that is just right below Colombia, is the opposite effect. When you have El Niño, you have an excess of rain. Or, for example, right now that we are just living La Niña, which is the opposite phase of this recurrent pattern. In Uruguay, we have like these strong droughts that they are having like right now. So it has huge implications. Actually, El Niño is one of the most studied weather patterns in the world. The studies started in the 70s, but there's a lot of research on that. But bad news for this year, this is going to be like a hot year, given that we're going to have El Niño. In the case of Colombia, we have like a strong a strong growth and lack of rates. This picture is for the 2016 El Nino event, that it was really strong. And I'm going to use that 2016 event for one reason, because it's a really interesting year, because also we have like a lot of shocks. We have like strikes. There were transportation strikes in the agricultural sector. There was increases in VAT taxes. And so there was a lot of things going. Also, we have like a huge drop on oil revenues that increases the exchange rate. So we have like a lot of shocks. So it's really disentangled what was going to be happening in inflation. So I'm going to show you like what our approach tells us about that particular episode. So the first idea here is that, as I mentioned, that we have like this effect of what we have here is ENSO, which is the blue line, and the other line is like a rain index that I constructed. And when we have in these shaded areas are like the strong El Nino episodes. So we have like that negative correlation with rates. In the case of Colombia, that's really important because the share of food in the CPI basket is important. And also we have like the electric energy production as well. So the first thing that we did here in this approach was to look at some VAR evidence. And there's a lot of studies that show that there's an impact on inflation, but we also see if there was like a second round effects on inflation expectations. So we take all the series that we have for different tenures and for different sources, market-based, break-even inflation or surveys. Those are all the series that we have in Colombia, around like 45 series. We also construct some principal component for the short-term inflation expectation measures, for the medium term, and for the long term, just dividing into groups to see what happens. And when we see like the correlation with El Nino phenomenon, it shouldn't be affected. Like if inflation expectations are anchored, this kind of supply shocks shouldn't have like no correlation at all. And we found like there's a correlation. But even if you find like that a correlation with actually the measure of El Nino is a measure that you have of the sea surface temperature on the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We try to make a more careful empirical exercise. So we estimate aviation VAR, trying to control for a lot of stuff. So we put there international food prices, we put a real exchange rate gap. We also have like short-term surprises from the monthly survey. Also, we have this is a shock that is kind of a supply shock related like with relative prices, industrial production, and these are the expectations. And we put like a completely exogenous variable because it's the weather. In X, we put this ENSO variable, which is the measure of the sea surface temperature anomalies. And to see what happens. And what we, well, in the VAR, we estimate this from 2003 to December 2020. If we just reduce the sample to incorporate COVID, to exclude the COVID-19 period, doesn't seem to alter the impulsive responses. But one thing, like VARs gets a little bit tricky when you have inflation after 2020. Like 21 and 22 is really messy. So you have to be careful when we're doing stuff because there's a lot of changes in relative prices as well. So we estimate the Bayesian VAR. And these are the impulse responses, and we did that for every single one of the inflation expectation series. This is just to show you what happened with these principal components for short-term, medium-term, and long-term inflation expectations. So there's like an impact of these weather shocks on inflation expectations. So using that SLI, so we take like two SLI facts here. That there's an impact on inflation and that there's an impact on inflation expectations. And we put that into our semi-structural model. The feature of that semi-structural model, which is pretty standard for central banks, and to incorporate these second round effects, is a model that it has like a IS curve. It has a Phillips curves for different baskets of the CPI. We have one for food, one for regulated items and services, and goods and services that exclude food and regulated. And given the structure of the CPI in Colombia, we have a lot of perishable foodstuffs that goes in that basket. So that is really affected. And then we have like most of the electric generation in Colombia is with hydro. So there's an impact on the regulated prices of energy. Okay. And the other stuff is that we have like a risk adjusted uncorded interest rate parity and a Taylor rule. So it's kind of a standard semi-structural model that is used in the central banks. The name of our model is 4GM. So we're modifying that model to include this feature. So this is the IS curve. It's pretty standard. I'm going to move to the Phillips curve because here's where the action is. And the idea here with these Phillips curves is that we have like some backward component, real marginal cost that is what we're going to modify, and inflation expectations. So let me show you like what is going to happen with these real marginal costs. If you have like goods and services, real marginal cost is just a weighted average of the output gap, the real exchange rate gap, and the real exchange rate gap. Pretty much that's it. But when we have the marginal cost for food and regulated, we include ENSO shocks there to affect the real marginal cost. So that has a direct impact on inflation, on inflation dynamics. Then we also have a modification in inflation expectations. So we use like this feature that is normal in these semi-structural models when you want to include endogenous credibility. The point here with these models, the semi-structural models with endogenous credibility, is that credibility is really, I would put it like really naive. It's a really naive process, but you get like some idea of what happens when credibility is low or not. And pretty much the credibility is that it's a stock that is between 0 and 1, and you have a process of this of this credibility. Pretty much is like it's inflation is around the target, credibility is going to go up, but if it deviates from the target, credibility goes down. Okay. And then if you have like that credibility process and the central bank is fully credible, this CT is going to be 1. So the ENSO shocks are not going to affect inflation expectations for food and regulated baskets. But if you have a central bank that is less than credible, when this parameter is between 0 and 1, you're going to find that your inflation expectation is a mix between the rational expectations of the model, and like a backward-looking component and ENSO shocks. That is the feature that actually we're incorporating that. To estimate those, well, when we have like these semi-structural models, the approach is a little bit more eclectic, to put it in some way. Some of these parameters are calibrated using the calibration of the central bank model. We also re-estimate a lot of these parameters, but something that happens when you try to introduce these weather-related shocks is that they're really hard to estimate, or there's not a lot of information. For example, like in most of the climate literature, you use damage functions, but there's a lot that we don't know about those damage function and those parameters. So pretty much the thing here is that we just, for example, these parameters related with ENSO, what we did is just inputs response matching with the VARs that we got, and that was a trick that we used there to get those parameters. Okay, and the rest of the model I'm just going to skip it because it's pretty standard. Okay. Then let me show you some of the results. As I mentioned, one of the things that we want to have is that we want to have like not only direct impact on inflation, but also impacts on inflation expectations. what we have here is an ENSO shock. In this case, is that ENSO temperatures anomalies are going like 1 degree higher. This is it's not Fahrenheit. It's I forgot. It's Celsius. Yeah, thank you. So it's 1 degree Celsius. The 2016 episode, which was like real extreme, was 2.5. So that is 1 degree that is going to be like a transitory with the persistence of the process that we're assuming for ENSO. And then what we're going to have is that food inflation is going to go is going to increase. Regulated inflation is going to increase as well. Also, food inflation expectations and regulated inflation expectations are going to go up. That creates that headline inflation and inflation expectations are going up as well. Okay. One of the things that we don't have like a direct impact on output. So the reaction on output here, what is going to happen is the reaction because of the nominal interest rate moving on, given the shock. So the idea here is that this transitory ENSO shock has a direct effect on food and regulated inflation. The increase in this basket is a consequence of the direct effect that adverse weather has on marginal costs, but also on inflation expectations for each basket. And one of the things with this is that if you see like the magnitudes, they may seem like small, but the point is like this is a shock for a transitory ENSO shocks. And if you remember the first graph that I show you of ENSO fluctuations, it has like a lot of persistence. Like ENSO tends to last a good deal of time. Just to give you an example of this last La Nina, which it was really extreme and really long, it took like 2 years. And the 1997 El Niño event also was like really long. So the idea here is that we have like these impulse responses, but probably doing a shock decomposition, it will show you like a better glimpse of the impact. And as I mentioned before, 2016 is a great experiment for us to test the model because there was a lot of things going on. So whatever model that you use to make a shock decomposition for Colombia of that year is that you will get in your shock decomposition, you will get like a huge bar for the cost push shocks. But there's a lot of things going on, as I mentioned in that year. So this is the historical decomposition, of course, of deviation from the steady state. And what we have is that, well, we have all the shocks of the model. The ones that we care are the food cost push shock and the ENSO shock. Remember, as I mentioned, there was a lot of things going on in 2016. Oil prices going down, exchange rate going up, strikes in the agricultural sector, in the transportation sector. So what we find is like there's like this huge bar, but look at ENSO shows there, like it has a like these are analyzed. These are analyzed quarterly rates. So food inflations go to 20%, and around like around 30% of the bar is related with ENSO shocks. Also, we found here that regulated inflation also was affected by these shocks, and consequently, we have the impact on headline inflation and inflation expectations. And the bad thing for central banks with these nasty kind of shocks, like this is nasty, thank you, nasty supply shocks, is that if you see in the graph, what we have in the line is the actual monetary policy rates. Actually, what the model is saying is that probably interest rates should have start increasing before that they actually did. And you see that actually the shocks related with ENSO are present that. So the idea here is that even though some of the common ideas when you have supply shocks of this nature is that there's no room for monetary policy, it creates like a bad situation for the monetary policy authority, because even though you don't want to act, because you know that it's related with weather. You are forced to act because it's having effects on inflation and on inflation expectations. So the bad news there is that if for some mechanisms, climate change start affecting this kind of weather patterns like El Nino, you may see that it's going to make the work for the central bank harder if that is the case and something of that nature happens. Last but not least, I'm going to go to the appendix. I didn't have too much time to talk about the credibility of how that looks, but this is just that I wanted to show you just putting these credibility parameters in the extremes, like 1 and 0. What happens when you have like a fully credible central bank and when you have a central bank that is not credible? So we have the Yenso chalk here, and not surprisingly, here the nature of the way that we're putting credibility in the model is that you have that inflation expectations, if the central bank is not credible, and headline inflations are going to go up really dramatically. But if the central bank is credible, the amount of how inflation expectations are going to be affected. So credibility is an important feature when you have like this kind of supply shocks related with weather that is important for the central bank to take into account. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Let's open up for questions, comments, suggestions. Okay, maybe I'll start if there are any. So I really enjoyed your paper, but as I was reading it, I was wondering, I mean, 3 or 4 things. So the first thing is that, I mean, these effects are really threshold events, right? So if you have a La Nina or El Nino, and it is a moderate El Nino and La Nina, doesn't really have an impact. So that's the one thing. The second thing is that El Nino is quite different to La Nina in terms of kind of asymmetric events, right? So if you have flooding, for example, might be quite extreme, but that doesn't have an impact on food inflation as much. Might have an impact on the insurance sector, right? We have flooding and stuff. And so I'm curious to know how you think about that. My other question is, I mean, I liked your. Okay, let me just take a step back. So, I mean, what we really worry as central bankers is that you might have an event like La Nina or El Nino, which one is more severe, right? And which becomes, you know, the history is important. You can look at extreme droughts. But the second issue might be more frequent. Instead of having a 2-year, you know, a drought, a severe drought lasts over 2 years, it lasts over 3 years, let's say, or 4 years, right? And I'll really like the fact that you've got this part in the annexure about the credibility. But what I think it might be useful is to actually move it to the main text and somewhat hypothesize, also link it to the smoothing parameter, right? Because if you've got this kind of shocks that we're not familiar with, it's quite a different impact. And the third thing that I've thought about, at least this is what we see in South Africa, and it goes back to just kind of explaining your story, is showing the impact on different commodities and also explaining what are the mitigation factors. So one mitigation factor, for example, if you have a moderate El Nino, is crop substitution, depending on the soil types. Is that possible? Is there a way to mitigate against these effects, which can help later with explaining your results and how that the dynamics involved? So those are 3 things. I don't know whether anybody else.
Just on your monetary policy reaction, the one component was the demand shock. What was that? So you had the cost pushing up inflation, and then you had a positive demand shock, right?
Yes, no, it was just and a standard Taylor rule.
No, you show the decomposition graph.
Check the composition.
Yeah.
We shock.
I'm
sorry. Sorry.
Response. Yeah, there on the bottom right.
Okay.
Or in the middle there. Yeah. You've got the, it looks like you've got a positive demand shock as well. So your middle graph on the bottom level,
Yes.
you've got a kind of a red. There's a bright red oil shock, which is
Yes.
negative, and then you've got a positive demand shock. What is that? Is that just kind of output gap? Positive
Yeah.
output gap. Yeah.
Yes, in the model, yeah, are the chocks in the IS curve.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
That-
it's
that's
not,
the
it's not
matchup.
being offset, but also a shock.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's not.
Okay.
No, but regarding,
Just let me ask you my last question.
yes,
What have you thought about, you've got precipitation indices, which are actually much better correlated.
Yes.
with, have you thought about using those rather than the ENSO
Yeah.
temperature indicator?
no, one of the reasons why I'll try to answer your question because they are really good and I'll try to remember them. And no, one of the things that when we use like these rain indices, like they were like forecasting like a specific components of the food basket, and also it correlates with ENSO. So we might change that in using that index. The advantage of using ENSO directly is because it's like a completely, well, rain is completely exogenous as well in this model. But the point is there's a lot of information about ENSO. So if you have like this put into your model that you can play, just putting NOAA's different paths for El ENSO and to see what happens. Otherwise, you may have to do like an intermediate phase when you just try to translate how ENSO is going to affect the rain measure that you are using. So that is why the reason that we use that. And even though we have that information for rain, it's not as timely as ENSO because you have like this monthly information that is always available, and they also update their forecast like on a monthly basis. So that is why the reason that we use that. The other thing that is important is that the time framework that we carry in this kind of models is like 2 years. It's just for the horizon of the monetary policy. There's not too much room to say like if there's alternative or the purpose of the model is not to evaluate those kind of alternative or mitigating policies. It allows us to construct like alternative scenarios given that all the things are given. It's not to construct like, okay, if you have subsidies or if you have changes in your trade policy to mitigate those kind of effects. This model doesn't answer those questions, but it allows you to make like simulations on the horizon of the monetary policy, or that is the purpose of the model, not to evaluate those kind of alternative policies, or the model is too limited to answer those questions. And the other thing that is really important is what you mentioned, because the problem with ENSO fluctuations is that they are not symmetric. Well, there's some kind of symmetry there, but Las Niñas are not as bad as El Niño. So that is something that is a non-linearity that happens with El ENSO. But again, there's this concern, like actually just to put like the official views of the climate science regarding this stuff is that there's no clear evidence that El Niño has been affected by climate change so far, but for the second part of the century, they consider that the most likely scenario is that is going to happen, at least for the IPCC report, which is like to put it in some way like the consensus. But there's a lot of research going on how this may be changing. So one of the things that we have seen is that the latest La Niñas have been like really, really bad. So even though on average, like in the case of Colombia, La Niña is excess of rains, even though that is positive for some crops and for the overall production, we have seen that we have had impacts on infrastructure as well. So even though we haven't seen it yet in the data, if those Las Niñas effects became like a stronger, there's something that is going to happen there that
that needs to be studied. So it's a really important policy observation on that regard. Yes.
We have space.
Yes, we do have 3 minutes.
Okay. All right. So I just wanted to follow up on what Constantine was speaking to in terms of, so you have modeled Enzo, so it's part of your model. But of course, as you both sort of agree, it doesn't follow that Enzo means everything comes to contraction. You can have El Nino, but fairly sort of fairly normal.
Yes.
So, yeah. So which would sort of then means that probably in your model actually you are well, the implications of then the modeling it's in and then actually the outset being not as bad means you're actually more, so the policy will be more aggressive than it should be. That would be almost like leads you to kind of policy that I just want to get a sense of how you're thinking. At what point did you want to sort of trigger, say now the answer should sort of be active?
Yeah.
More or less, because I know we all worry about it, but I think there is a threshold thing that you tend to worry after a certain sort of level is crossed. But if you're not crossed, then well, it's something that is almost like no.
Yeah. No.
Just wait, let's get Lawrence's question.
Okay.
It's in one place through all this, which is, to what extent can you apply this to other exogenous shocks that are affecting the economy? Either weather shocks that are not directly tied to the Enso cycle, or shocks which come about through weather events occurring elsewhere in foreign markets or economic problems and so on. But I'm most interested though to know, have you been applying this model? Has this model been adopted within the monetary policy? Has it been implemented?
Well, one of the things like it's based on one of the core models. I may say that, like the 4GM is one of the models that we use, and there's a lot of concerns regarding El Nino right now. So I think that is the official answer that I can use. No, but one of the things that you may use it is for simulation of a strong event. Is that is related with your question that I was going to mention. In this model, like the mechanism is always working. So probably you should have like some kind of non-linearity, but that we're not putting there. But when you start caring about El Nino is when the threshold is 1.5 degrees anomalies. And all the models right now, like they have been just showing, like at least for this year, that is going to be the case. So it pretty much serves to make like not the base scenario, but to construct alternative or risk scenarios. That is the main idea of this model. And why we don't use it for other shocks is like probably there's another concerns or other weather shocks that may affect. But the things that this is the big one, like when we are concerned about the weather is because something is happening with these El Nino fluctuations. That is so.
Last question.
Yeah, last question. Very, very short. So if you drop your Enso shock from your analysis, the yellow bars will show up as a what in the historical as a cost push shock, right?
Yes, a cost push shock. You
So
have like
another way to ask the same question.
Yes.
Is there any difference in the optimal reaction of the monetary authority to a cost push shock versus an Enso shock? I mean, if it's the same, that's why. I mean, that is a good point. Like, actually, I don't have that exercise, but I don't know because it's the central node. So what you have here is that you have like the cost push shock, like having like all these bar there, like all this contribution, and in the monetary policy shock, like also you may see like a slightly lower reaction. And that is why it's because the cost push shock doesn't have like this direct impact or direct link with inflation expectations. Right.
And why we're putting that is because we found that there's evidence that even controlling for a lot of stuff, that inflation expectations may be affected.
Lalo and Nicola, we are not here right now. The motivation for the paper is due to rising fiscal risk in South Africa and globally as a matter of fact, which has raised the question of whether fiscal dominance is emerging, especially if inflation becomes less benign. So the pandemic saw three things happen. First, sovereign debt, which has already been very high in many economies, rise even further. The expansion of central bank balance sheets. And in 2011, the inflationary pressure became more pronounced, reaching historical highs in 2022. So with the high debt levels and the role that central banks play in their sovereign debt markets, especially in advanced economies, the question of fiscal dominance becomes more important, and the response of monetary policy to combat inflation also becomes very important. And the story is not too different in South Africa and other emerging market economies, where we see high debt levels and inflation rates persisting. Debt to GDP ratios in South Africa are around 70%. Monetary policy rates are on the rise, and inflation, although has come down a little bit, still remains above the target band. So the literature on fiscal dominance is concerned with how fiscal policy affects price stability and the conduct of monetary policy. The point of departure is that sovereign debt is inflationary, and the extent to which monetary policy accommodates fiscal policy determines if fiscal dominance emerges. Sargent and Wallace describe a fiscal dominant regime as one in which the fiscal authority sets primary budget balances, projections, independently of the change in debt stock, and the central bank has to accommodate any shortfall in government bonds through seigniorage. Now, our study departs from LIPA, who categorizes active and passive fiscal and monetary policy, and this depends on how constrained each authority is in setting its policy instrument. So a fiscal policy is active when, as I said, the authority sets its primary budget balance independent of changes in government debt. And monetary policy is active when the authority is able to set its policy instrument to deviations in inflation from the target, and does not need to accommodate fiscal policy by deflating away inflation. So fiscal dominant regime is one in which fiscal policy is active and monetary policy is passive. So we also need to take into account the global context, and this matters especially for a small open economy like South Africa and for monetary policy. So there's been some research on how global spillovers or spillovers from advanced or major economies such as the US would feed into the domestic financial system through global capital flows, in what Ray terms the global financial cycle. There's also been some growing research on how risk premium can act as a conduit through which external effects are transmitted into the domestic financial system, and this affects the transmission of monetary policy. There's also Blanchard's study of Brazil's 2002 to 2003 macroeconomic crisis. So in order for us to determine whether fiscal and monetary policy is active or passive, we observe the policy rules for monetary fiscal policy. For monetary policy, we use the standard rule, but we also take note that the global context matters, as I mentioned before. And for the fiscal rule, we use the basic relation between the primary budget balance and the evolution in debt stock. So the standard fiscal rule in the literature is, as it is shown here, it's the primary budget balance as a function of the change in debt. Now in South Africa, National Treasury adopted the expenditure ceiling as its fiscal anchor in around 2012. And this is CPI adjusted every year to maintain a real constant, to maintain a real expenditure at a constant level. So this is basically provided to line departments as a guidance on their expenditure projections. And this is the consolidated national expenditure projection. And this, together with the revenue projections, which is done separately based on macroeconomic projections, gives us a primary budget balance forecast. Now, depending on National Treasury's fiscal stance, they may adjust their primary budget balances subjectively by moving the expenditure ceiling up or down. And to the extent that the expenditure ceiling allows the primary budget balance to respond to changes in government debt, we can view this fiscal rule as the standard in the literature. So this is the fiscal rule that we want to estimate. We have the budget balance as a function of past budget balance, the deviation of debt to GDP from its target, and the output gap. Now, these are just simple reaction functions as an approximation of what the authority would follow. So it's just a parsimonious way to describe the drivers of policy decisions. So here we're interested in the beta, which represents the change in the primary budget balance to any change in debt. And when this is negative, we have an active or less responsive fiscal policy. And when it's positive, we have a passive or responsive fiscal policy. So just for ease of understanding in the slides to follow, I'll just refer to responsive or less responsive policy. So in the literature, most studies that focus on monetary and fiscal policy rules rely on structural models. However, here we've used a Markov switching regression model to estimate two individual policy rules, the monetary and fiscal policy one. So Markov switching regression models exhibit different dynamics across unobserved states, or what we call regimes. And it basically captures structural breaks or any multiple state phenomena. So it basically allows the parameters to vary across states or regimes where these states or regimes are random and follow a Markov process. The time of transition from one state or regime to another and the duration changes in the state is also random. And we cannot know with certainty in which state or regime the process lies, but we can estimate the probability of being in a regime or state, since the estimation of Markov switching models allows us to find the probability at each point in time, almost like a common filter. So here we have the estimation result of the fiscal policy rule that I just showed. We have four different specifications because the D star in this equation is, as the literature points out, not always easy to find. And so we use three different definitions. The first equation uses a debt deviation from a projected debt from the National Treasury. The second one uses a debt deviation from a mean. The third one uses the change in debt to GDP ratio. And the fourth one is a bit of a different rule. It's a debt rule, and it has the output gap and the debt deviation from mean, and the dependent variable here is the debt deviation from its mean as well. So we tried to characterize the regimes into a less responsive and responsive regime, but because of the results are mixed, we just focused on equation 1 and 4, and so the top table has the less responsive regime and the second table has the responsive regime. And then here we show the regime probabilities. So we see that up until 2006, fiscal policy was less responsive, and I guess from 2007 until 2011, it became a bit more responsive, but in the most recent period, it's been less responsive. This is the monetary policy rule that we will estimate. It's the Taylor rule as we have it in our South African Reserve Bank quarterly projection model. So the interest rate at a particular meeting is a function of the interest rate going into that meeting, the neutral rate, the inflation deviation from its target, and the output gap. And here again, we're interested in gamma pi, which represents the response of inflation to deviations of inflation from its target. So we use real-time data obtained from the main forecasting models of the Reserve Bank to estimate this following reaction function that we show. And here we want to test, we still want to test gamma pi, but in this case, gamma pi is equal to beta 2 divided by 1 minus beta 1. And when this is less than 1, we have a passive or less responsive monetary policy. When it's greater than 1, we have an active or responsive monetary policy. And as I mentioned earlier, we do also add some additional explanatory variables that might capture the global context. So here we have the results from estimating the Markov switching regression model on the monetary policy rule. The top part of the table is the less responsive rule, and the bottom part is the responsive. One. Now it might be a bit confusing. The coefficient we're interested in again is this inflation deviation, but that's the beta. So we need to adjust it to get gamma pi. And when we do that, the bottom part of the table is actually more responsive, and the top part is the less responsive one. What we also note here is that the results are quite robust across each specification. The global variables also matter. So long-term rates matter, the VIX, the US interest rate and exchange rate also matter. So here we show the monetary policy regime, and we see that from around 2006 up until 2014, with the exception of the global financial crisis, monetary policy was more responsive. This was also around the time of the global financial crisis, where there was high risk and high inflation rates. So it required a much more responsive monetary policy. It became less responsive from around 2014. And around this time, inflation was coming down. Inflation expectations were also much better anchored. And so I guess it didn't need that much of a reaction from monetary policy. If we combine these two regime probabilities together, we can group them into almost three distinct groupings. And I see the colors a little bit difficult to see here. But the green, which is this area here, shows a responsive monetary policy and a responsive fiscal policy. And in the definition of LIFA, that's an active monetary policy and a passive fiscal policy, which suggests a monetary dominant regime. The orange area, which is this one here, shows a responsive monetary policy and a less responsive fiscal policy. So that's an active monetary policy and an active fiscal policy. Then the purple area, which is the most recent area, represents a less responsive monetary policy and a less responsive fiscal policy. And if we also look, define this in LIFA's definition, that responds to a passive monetary policy and an active fiscal policy. And that suggests that it's a fiscal dominant regime. So to conclude, we see that monetary policy was generally responsive across all the regimes. However, it appears to be less responsive in the most recent regime. Fiscal policy responded in an attempt to contain debt until 2012, but has since been less responsive. And probability regimes estimated from the market switching regression model suggest that there is some evidence of fiscal dominance since 2016.
For questions, suggestions, more or less.
Thank you very much for that. It's a really nice presentation. It's an interesting study you've done. I mean, Markov regressions can be very useful in this. But you're using Markov regressions as a piece of economic history, very backward looking. I'm not sure what date does your data sample in?
So for the fiscal one, we ended in 2019 because we couldn't account for the COVID period. But for the monetary one, we included it because we were using real-time data. It was okay to use to include the COVID period.
Okay, so then it leads me to my question. What can you tell us? What can the application of your Markov model tell us about where we're going from here? It's a serious question because the timing of the location and the length of transition, speed of transition is potentially useful in forecasting. I'm just curious as to whether you can get that from your model.
Yeah, so the Markov switching regression actually gives you the persistence of being in each regime, and it's very strong. So once you're in a regime, it's very likely that you'll remain in that regime. So I guess because we're in this fiscal dominant regime right now, I would say that we would remain there until there's major structural reforms and fiscal consolidation.
Yeah. Okay. I must say one thing I found it interesting that actually in your presentation you do have a link with Ekaterina's and vice versa. Ekaterina's got a link with yours. I mean, in the sense that you both, you identifying this premium as an important channel, and I think that is valuable. But I'm not sure about it is whether the basic LIFA model is really the best starting place we've had for this time. But for your model, the reason I say it is, the Reserve Bank's only got one option. Well, there's got two options. If the fiscal authority is constrained by debt, by debt, yeah, by debt. It's constrained by debt. Then the Reserve Bank has to finance it, according to this. But is that really, you've got liquid financial markets, various types that are not in South Africa and international, that don't necessarily show up in the form of marketable debt. They show up in the debt to GDP ratio. So is the only option for the monetary authority finance the fiscal deficit? I'm not sure about that. In other words, I think the leading model is very simple, and that's fine. We can use simple models, but do they tell us? Do they tell us really what's happening?
I think with this question,
Okay, no, thanks, Michelle. Interesting presentation. Maybe a point or two from me. So the first bit is probably hopefully I didn't misunderstand, mischaracterize what you show in the paper. So the period was like the period between 2012 and about 2018. At least if I look at one of your charts, it shows well, some attempted building like moving towards a positive structural balance or budget balance. I think it's in the but even that one is fine. So but then you characterize that period, I think, as active fiscal policy. So I'm not sure if I got it right. Then the other thing that is sort of I find striking is in the latter period, the purple, where you have where you sort of end up sort of concluding that well we have the fiscal dominance. But I thought if I looked at your estimations, the parameter, the gamma pi is larger than 1. I might have done the wrong math there. But I thought it was larger than 1, which would by definition mean that it's actually sort of with an active monetary policy. So I just want to get a sense whether that would be the case. And obviously, I think again, looking at the evidence in terms of what the monetary policy has been doing or has managed to achieve during that period, is it easy to make the case that we are in a fiscal dominant regime when actually, if you exclude the COVID, the post-COVID period, actually the MPC successfully brought inflation and the expectations to target, which you point out in the paper that of course the monetary policy didn't need to be aggressive because they were essentially fine-tuned, they achieved their goal. So how then do you spread that with the idea of fiscal dominance?
Yeah, thanks, witness. That is interesting. You're right, the gamma pi is greater than 1 in both regimes, and that's why I say monetary policy was always responsive to deviations of inflation from target. It was just less responsive in the more recent period, but it has been responsive. And yeah, so we can't really say that it's a passive monetary policy, but to the extent that fiscal policy is active in the more recent period, I do think there's evidence of fiscal dominance, especially with the high debt levels and it feeding into the yield curve and the bond market, making them very sticky. And so any responses of monetary policy is not as effective as it would have been.
Well, but isn't the idea of dominance that the MPC is constrained? But can we sort of make that claim or the argument that the MPC is actually constrained by fiscal developments? That's my point. Or is that their job is made harder, but certainly they are free to do whatever they feel like doing.
Yeah.
So which is a different thing.
Yeah, so I don't think it's constrained in that sense. I just think it's a bit more difficult to achieve its goal looking at the transmission mechanism, because any increase in interest rates doesn't necessarily feed in the way we'd expect it to feed in, just because yields are so sticky because of the high risk on fiscal policy, the high risk premium, and yeah. higher risk of default. So actually Blanchard's paper, that's how he looked at fiscal dominance. It's more so that at high levels of debt, any increase in interest rates actually lead to a real depreciation rather than an appreciation. And so this feeds back into a higher inflation, and it's just a cycle that then leads monetary policy almost redundant in terms of interest rate changes.
Are there any other questions? No. Thank you all. It's a great session.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you. Because in terms of food inflation, right, so if you're a farmer,